carry me back to old Virginia. Carry me back to old Virginia.
Thank you for tuning into this, the last episode of the Roanoke Island series for the Virginia History Podcast. Last time I left off with John White having to make a heart-wrenching choice to leave his family and colony behind in order to undertake a supply mission. John White's anguish at leaving his family and colony behind was not helped at all during his journey back to England in 1587. The trouble began when the men trying to raise the ship's anchor found the task extraordinarily difficult. As the crew undertook the process, one of the capstan's bars broke, sending the anchor-raising wheel backward against the 12 men who were trying to turn it forward. This mishap inflicted severe injuries to the men, which limited the crew's ability to make a worthwhile second attempt at lifting the ship's anchor. Seeing the plight that he was in, Edward Spicer, the flyboat's captain, decided to cut the ship loose, and their journey from Virginia began, but the damage had already been done. The initial injury to Spicer's crew must have taken a toll on the small, 15-man crew, because when they reached the Azores, only 5 men were fit enough to sail the vessel, according to John White. The injuries suffered, as well as some type of sickness, also plagued Spicer's men, which made sailing near impossible. Fernandez, on the other ship returning to England, the Lion, also seems to have been suffering illness among his crew, or he should have exchanged crew members to aid Spicer's voyage. But illness may only be partly to blame for Fernandez's failure to relieve the sick crew, because it is more likely that Fernandez wanted to play pirate before returning to England. Thus, Spicer's problems would only slow down Fernandez's mission. Either way, Spicer felt it best not to stick around the islands for long, and left the Azores urgently. His urgency, however, proved brutal for his crew. Soon after leaving the Azores, Spicer's ship and crew encountered a new series of continual problems. First, they had little wind, and the ships creeped along. Next, a slow leak sprung, which began draining fresh drinking water needed for the trip across the Atlantic. Then, after days of no wind, a series of heavy storms blew the ships well off course. The combination of the ship's tossing, along with poor water rations and already ill passengers, plagued the crew, 2 of whom did not survive and died at sea. White must also have suffered from the ordeal, as he wrote that he was expecting to perish at sea. But White was wrong. Almost 2 months after he left Roanoke behind, one of the few remaining crewmen spotted Ireland on the horizon. They were saved, but only just. The crew was in such bad shape that other boats nearby rushed to provide the transatlantic survivors emergency rations of food and water. After 2 days of receiving aid, the men were taken ashore, where sadly 3 more died, and 3 others were deemed too ill to continue on the trip to England. White, however, had to continue onward in service to Raleigh, his family, and his colony. He arrived in England on November 5th to reports that Fernandez's ship had arrived 3 weeks earlier in horrendous shape. Many on his ship also died, and most were near death. But White had no time to reflect about his erstwhile enemy's plight. He had to set about organizing a new supply mission to aid the colony. Seemingly back at home safely, White's arrival back in England was not the end of his troubles. A week prior to his return, relations between Spain and England had completely deteriorated. The Privy Council therefore ordered all English ships to stay home, as they were to be used in the home defense effort against the ominous Spanish Armada, which threatened to invade England at any moment. Apparently, as part of Spain's grievances against England, Philip II did not like Protestant England's encroaching into the New World. His anti-Protestant hatred fueled his desire to take England, which had left Rome's dominion under Henry VIII, back for the Church, and stop wicked Protestantism's spread. This being the situation, the English had to focus all attentions eastward, and Raleigh agreed with this viewpoint. This meant that White sailing back to Roanoke was not going to happen in 1587. But that didn't keep White and Raleigh from trying. Raleigh argued that his colony would help against Spanish aggression by diverting Spanish attention westward. While arguing his case, he ordered Grenville to outfit another pinnace with supplies to aid the Roanoke colonists. Meanwhile, White busied himself with finding new settlers, but by March 1588 they had yet to sail. Further, new reports outlined an extremely serious situation, as the Armada was larger than first imagined. Grenville and his ships had to join England's defense preparations, but there was a catch. Sir Francis Drake viewed at least 2 ships to be unfit for battle. Those 2 ships were then allowed to sail to Virginia, which were then stocked and manned for the trip. But the crew was a problem. The best mariners for the job were all being used to defend the realm. White was thus given Captain Arthur Facey, who was more interested in piracy than colonizing, and Pedro Diaz, who was more interested in Spanish interests than in helping the English colony. After setting sail in late April 1588, the 2 ragged ships wasted 11 days giving chase to ships of little or no value, before finally moving westward. But again, White's bad luck struck. The English who chased ships up to this point became the sought-after prey. 2 larger French ships had sized up the 2 smaller English ships and decided to attack them on May 6th. Captain Facey tried to outrun the French, but he could not outpace the aggressors, and after realizing this, he turned to stand ground. Fighting ensued, which White described as intense and lasted for more than an hour and a half, after which severe casualties were counted on both sides, including numerous wounds that White had suffered. The English couldn't endure any longer and surrendered. After the French looted the small fleet and sank 1 ship, the would-be colonial resuppliers realized that they had to sail back to England. And with the specter of the Spanish Armada plaguing England's shores, no new journey to Roanoke Island would be planned for 1588. It would be more than a year and a half before another resupplying attempt was tried. Planning and business posturing, which must have necessarily included political intrigue as well, was certainly done to some extent during 1589. But nothing really happened for one unexplained reason or another. Yet finally in March 1590, White was once again ready to sail for Roanoke. Déjà vu struck again, however, as he was aboard a privateering-oriented fleet, this time captained by John Watts, and supported by another name soon to be well known in Virginia, Christopher Newport. But other than accidentally sinking 2 smaller boats called shallops, this transatlantic sailing was relatively uneventful, especially when compared to White's previous crossings. Once they arrived in the West Indies, however, the English began seeking plunder, as they raided as many Spanish vessels and outposts as could be found. Weeks of such piratical activities were recorded by White in his diary. Such activities annoyingly delayed his arrival back at Roanoke Island until August 15, 1590, when White at long last had returned. The English saw smoke on the island, a good sign, so they thought, and on the next day they disembarked to find the colonists. Yet upon arrival they found no one. They lost sight of the smoke seen on the previous day, but a second smoke plume came into view near the area they named Kendrick's Mount. White diverted the scouting group toward that sign, but the journey to get there was taxing in the mid-Atlantic August heat. This proved exhausting, especially as the crew realized that the smoke was coming from nothing more than a brush fire. This wasted day proved extremely costly, as White soon found out. The next day, after more dilly-dallying by the English, White and 15 men were to attempt another search. By the time they were ready, however, the weather had drastically changed along the coastline as a powerful nor'easter had swept through the region. The storm took a serious toll as 1 ship ran aground and another was broken and overturned in the ocean. Lives were also lost, among them Captains Skinner and Spicer, as the storm continued to unleash her fury. Once the storm subsided, the remaining English collected their wits and again moved northward to Roanoke for another investigation, where no one was found. What was found were Indian footprints, various small cannons, White's rusty armor, weather-worn books and maps, as well as various other leftovers strewn across the ground supplies. The houses were torn down, and intriguingly, 2 prominent trees displayed carvings on their trunks. One tree had the letters CRO, and another the word Croatoan. Both carvings did not indicate the distress symbol of a cross on them, so White reasoned that the colonists had moved off of the island as planned. He had no reason to panic, not yet at least, especially as Croatoan was where Manteo, the friendly Indian, was from. That being the case, White's next plan was to sail southward to Croatoan on the following day. But another heavy storm arose which mightily plagued the remaining ships. Also, as the storm was breaking overhead and at sea, it was remembered that 6 men were still on the island gathering fresh water for the trip. Those on the ships reasoned that the 6 men needed to be saved, and sent 5 other men to rescue those ashore. But the storm turned so ugly that the 11 men were left behind as the ships planned to sail southward, thus adding to those lost on Roanoke Island. As the storm continued, the dangers proved to be too great to sail southward. Going to Croatoan was thusly called off. In fact, the storm had already begun pushing the fleet outward to sea, where it was reasoned that it was in such poor shape that a voyage back to England had to be chosen. White was so agonizingly close, especially after waiting for 3 years to sail across the Atlantic. Yet failure constantly haunted him. He would never return to Virginia. and thus Raleigh's New World plan ended where the lost colony myths began. Raleigh did try to find the colony one more time, yet 12 years later, but his mission, like all others before them, proved to be a failure, and nothing was found. White all but vanished from recorded history in the meantime, and no other attempts were made by Raleigh to find the colonists. Raleigh's fortunes also worsened in 1603 when newly crowned King James I imprisoned Elizabeth's one-time favorite. He would be released for a second failed South American adventure. The first failure occurred during Elizabeth's reign, but after that failure, Raleigh was tried, found guilty, and executed for treason by James in 1618. What happened to the colonists? Various attempts by other explorers since 1590 up until the Jamestown colony to present-day archaeological findings have sought to answer the longest-lasting American historical mystery, but we may never know what happened to the 1587 colonists. However, let me outline some of the predominant theories as well as introduce newly found information. John Smith and William Strachey from the Jamestown colony both recorded that Chief Wahun Sonnecock, better known as Powhatan, claimed to have killed the lost colonists just before the Jamestown settlers arrived in 1607. The colonists had apparently been living peaceably among the Chesapeake tribe for 20 years, but Indian prophecies urged Powhatan to slaughter the English or suffer a worse fate. Whether Powhatan had killed the colonists or not, the Jamestown settlers searched at least until 1612 for their lost countrymen, but they discovered nothing conclusive. Another seemingly quite plausible idea is argued that the English eventually integrated into various surrounding tribes as the colonists possibly separated into smaller groups to move inland. Indeed, reports do exist of Indians being seen that had distinctly English features by both Smith and Strachey. Historian John Lawson also wrote that in 1709 there were Croatoans who claimed English ancestry. Other reports, such as a French Huguenot colony, claimed to have met Tuscarora Indians who had blonde hair and blue eyes. According to this evidence, historians until the 1880s strongly believed that this theory was the answer to the case. But other historians cast doubt on the then accepted hypothesis by pointing to evidence of an Indian attack at Lane's Fort. The predominant 20th century opinion comes from David Beers Quinn, the giant among Roanoke Island historians, who argued that the colony stayed intact and moved westward, quote, 50 miles into the Main, end quote, before they were eventually destroyed by Powhatan. Recent archaeological digs in Bertie County at a location designated Site X add credence to this view, because Site X is located almost exactly 50 miles westward from Roanoke Island along the Chowan River. The idea for the current digs came from the discovery of a patch on the Virginia Pars map in 2012. Researchers X-ray scanned the map, which revealed a fort under the patch. This discovery prompted the First Colony Foundation to investigate the region, which revealed 16th century English artifacts along the Chowan River, perhaps across from an Indian village also discovered about the same time. This being the case, the Roanoke colony has received much attention and stands to receive much more deserved attention in forthcoming years by historians and archaeologists. A lesser offered theory is that the Spanish found the colony and destroyed it, but no Spanish record of this has ever been found. Further, the Spanish are known to have been seeking the colony throughout the 1590s and in fact did find Roanoke, but the same Roanoke that White found in 1590, that of an uninhabited mess. The Spanish had no idea what they had discovered, as they continued to look northward for the supposed English settlement. Finally, and least credibly of all theories, are the Dare Stones, which were discovered between 1937 and 1941. I really don't want to spend a lot of time on these, especially as the most credible sources view the entire lot of 49 stones as fakes. For what it's worth, however, the first stone was discovered in 1937 when a man brought a 21-pound stone to Dr. Hayward Pierce of Brenau College in Georgia. The stone was apparently found along the Chowan River and had Eleanor Dare's initials on it, which prompted Dr. Pierce to do more study. While he was studying the first stone, more stones were discovered by L.E. Hammond, who delivered these stones to Pierce in order to obtain a reward. As a result, attention for the stones reached a fevered pitch as the discovery seemed legitimate, and other historians, most notably Harvard's Samuel Eliot Morison, gave their seals of approval. But it was all just a myth, as one reporter proved. Saturday Evening Post journalist Boyden Sparks was, like everyone else, intrigued by the stones and felt that he had a story in the making. Shortly after he began his research, however, Sparks noted that L.E. Hammond was virtually untraceable, which is still the case today. From there, other odd connections such as the people finding the stones were all acquainted in one form or another. Sparks' questioning became more serious after other forgery clues arose, such as the type of stone wasn't native to the region, nor was it durable enough to stand the test of time. Also, some of the words used on the stones didn't enter the English language until much later. And finally, the type of tools used on the stones seemed to close the case. He reasoned that the stones were all a forgery, and everyone agreed, thus shattering many academic careers, especially Dr. Pierce's. That the stones were fakes was the accepted view until 2015, when the stones were once again subjected to tests, after which a group of archaeologists, linguists, and stone cutters declared the first stone to be, in their viewpoint, authentic. This believed to be authentic stone, supposedly written by Eleanor Dare, talks of violent tragedy, adding weight to the theory that an Indian attack killed off the colonists. When that attack occurred, however, no one can know for sure, especially as the date on the stone doesn't seem to fit the period of events. At this point in the narrative, no one can know much with any certainty. One of the theories, or a combination of some of the theories, or perhaps a completely different reality could be true. But that's what makes this story so captivating. Everyone who becomes acquainted with Roanoke wants to know more, must know more. Everyone likes a good mystery, and almost for that reason alone, this tragic story endures. For more information, such as what the First Colony Foundation is currently doing at Site X, please check out my webpage, which has links to their fascinating work. I also have other links concerning Fort Raleigh National Park, which, if you have not visited, is more than worth the trip to Roanoke Island. Stick around after visiting the location, which has a museum and redone Fort Raleigh on the original foundation, for Paul Green's famous 1937 play, The Lost Colony. It is on show throughout the warmer months and can be viewed in their wonderful seaside amphitheater. Of note on my website are the resources I consulted for this Roanoke Island series. Special attention should be paid to at least 3 of those sources. David Beers Quinn's work on Roanoke is unparalleled. Every other source on the list quotes from Quinn's research, and for that he is indispensable to the study. Karen Ordall Cooperman offers a somewhat condensed but equally scholarly book on Roanoke that is quite readable, and is considerably shorter than Quinn's work. Finally, the easiest and most enjoyable, as well as most chronologically written work on Roanoke Island is David Stick's Roanoke Island, The Beginnings of English America. I personally relied heavily upon this work to keep my events in order. In addition to the podcast website, if you have not already subscribed to the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher, please do so that you don't miss an episode. Finally, please like the podcast on Facebook. It'd be much appreciated. Thanks again for listening. Please return next time when I will begin telling the equally tragic and compelling, but successful, Jamestown story.
Mas tudo bate despedido dos embazes.